You know those stories people tell about haunted places? The ones you hear at parties or around campfires, where everyone tries to one-up each other with tales of ghosts and eerie encounters? I never believed them. Not really. I figured it was all just a bunch of folklore and overactive imaginations. That was until I stayed in room 308. It was last October when I decided to get away for a weekend. Life had been stressful, and I needed a break. I found this old hotel, the Delaney, nestled in a small town that seemed untouched by time. It had this quaint charm about it, like stepping into the past. The kind of place where the air smells of old wood and you can hear every creak of the floorboards. When I checked in, the receptionist handed me a key with a slight pause. She looked at it for just a second too long before giving it to me. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wish I had. The key was to room 308. The room was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. As I walked towards it, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. By the time I reached the door, I felt a chill, but I shrugged it off. It was an old building, drafty and full of creaks. Nothing unusual, right? When I stepped inside, the room was just as you'd expect, quaint with an antique bed, a dresser, and a small sitting area by the window. But something was off. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and it was colder than the rest of the hotel. I figured the heating was just bad in that part of the building. I mean, what else could it be? That night, after a decent dinner in the hotel's dining room, I returned to the room, ready to crash. I was exhausted from the drive and just wanted a good night's sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The room was too quiet, like a thick, unnatural silence that pressed down on me. Every creak of the floorboards outside, every rustle of the curtains, made my heart race. Then, just as I was starting to doze off, I heard it. A soft, steady tapping on the window. Now, I was on the third floor, so it couldn't have been someone outside. Maybe a branch? But when I listened more closely, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Like someone was tapping, waiting for me to notice. I sat up, trying to shake off the unease, and that's when I felt it, this overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. The room was dark, but something felt wrong, like there was someone else in there with me. My skin prickled as I slowly turned to face the window. And then I saw it. In the dim light, I noticed something moving, a reflection in the old mirror above the dresser. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But then I saw it clearly. A figure, tall and thin, standing just behind me, staring at me through the mirror. It wasn't me, and it wasn't a trick of the light. It was someone else. A man, with hollow, dark eyes and a twisted, unnatural grin. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I reached for the lamp beside the bed, my hand shaking so badly I almost knocked it over. The second the light flooded the room, the figure vanished. The mirror was just a mirror again, reflecting nothing but the empty room. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, that I'd imagined it, but deep down, I knew better. I could still feel his presence, like he was hiding just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the lights on and sat there, staring at that damn mirror, terrified that if I looked away, he'd come back. The hours dragged on, and by the time the first light of dawn crept through the window, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying in that room another minute. As soon as the front desk opened, I was there, bags in hand, demanding to check out. The receptionist didn't even ask why. She just nodded, like she'd seen it all before. As I handed back the key, she gave me this look, a mix of pity and understanding, and simply said, "Room 308, right?" I left the Delaney Hotel that morning and never looked back. But the memory of that night haunts me. I've done some research since then, trying to understand what I experienced. It turns out Room 308 has a history, a dark one. Decades ago, a man murdered his wife in that room before taking his own life. They say his spirit never left, that he's still there, waiting in the mirror for his next victim. So if you ever find yourself in an old hotel with a key in your hand, take a moment to check the room number. And if you see 308 on the door, do yourself a favor. Leave and don't look in the mirror. You know that feeling when you move into a new home? The excitement, the possibilities, the fresh start. That's exactly how I felt when I bought my first house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was everything I had ever wanted: cozy, with a nice yard, friendly neighbors, and most importantly, space. But there was one thing that came with the house that I hadn't bargained for. It started out as nothing more than a peculiar feeling. The basement, a typical unfinished space with cement floors and exposed pipes, always seemed colder than the rest of the house. I chalked it up to poor insulation and didn't think much of it. But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time I went down there. The basement had a small, dusty window that let in just enough light to cast long, eerie shadows across the floor. I had planned to use the space for storage, but every time I went down to put a box away, I felt as though I was being watched. You know how people say they can feel a presence? That's exactly what it was, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting, watching. One evening, about a month after I moved in, I decided to tackle some organizing in the basement. I was sorting through old boxes, trying to make sense of the chaos, when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps on the cement floor. I froze, my heart racing, and listened. The sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a draft or the house settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it, the presence, stronger than ever, like someone was right behind me. Slowly, I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the same dimly lit basement with its shadows and musty smell. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house sent my imagination spiraling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the house wasn't as empty as it seemed. But what could I do? It was my home now, and I wasn't about to let some creepy basement scare me off. The next day, I went to work, trying to put the previous night's events out of my mind. But when I came home, I found something that made my blood run cold. The basement door, which I always kept closed, was slightly ajar. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the dark gap between the door and the frame, dread creeping up my spine. I knew I hadn't left it open. I was meticulous about keeping it shut because of how much the basement unnerved me. So why was it open now? Summoning what little courage I had, I slowly pushed the door open and flicked on the light. The basement looked exactly as it had before, cold, empty, silent. But as I stepped down the stairs, I noticed something that hadn't been there the day before. On the dusty cement floor near the center of the room was a single footprint. It was faint, but unmistakable, a bare foot, too small to be mine. I stared at it, my mind racing. There was no way someone could have gotten into the house. All the doors and windows were locked, and the alarm hadn't gone off. And yet there it was, a footprint, as clear as day. I didn't stay in the basement long after that. I grabbed what I needed and got out, slamming the door shut behind me. That night, I barricaded myself in my bedroom, every light in the house blazing. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that footprint, felt that presence. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. I would come home to find lights turned on that I knew I had turned off, doors slightly open when I had left them closed, and always that feeling of being watched, especially whenever I was near the basement. I started avoiding it altogether, storing things in the garage instead. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't escape the sense that something was down there. The breaking point came one night when I heard it again, the shuffling footsteps, but this time they were on the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, frozen in bed. The sound was unmistakable, slow and deliberate, as if someone was dragging their feet up the wooden steps. I wanted to run, to get out of the house and never come back, but I was paralyzed with fear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting for the door to open, for whatever it was to come inside. But nothing happened. The door remained closed, the house silent once more. After what felt like hours, I finally dared to move, inching toward the door to press my ear against it. There was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the pounding of my own heartbeat. I don't know how I made it through that night, but by morning, I had made up my mind. I packed a bag and left the house, staying with a friend until I could figure out what to do. I couldn't live there anymore, not with whatever was lurking in the basement. Eventually, I sold the house, losing money in the process but gaining my sanity. I never told the new owners about the footprint or the footsteps. I convinced myself it was better that way, that maybe it was all just in my head. But deep down, I know what I felt, what I heard. To this day, I can't walk past a basement door without a shiver running down my spine. And I'll never forget the way it felt to stand in that basement, knowing I wasn't alone. It was the fall of 1999, just before the turn of the millennium, when I found myself in the small town of Danvers, Massachusetts. I was a freelance photographer back then, always chasing after the next big shot. Rumors had been swirling about the old Danvers State Hospital, a massive, crumbling asylum that had been abandoned for years. Locals whispered about strange occurrences, but it was the tales of ghostly apparitions that piqued my interest. I figured it would make for an eerie but captivating photo series. Little did I know it would be my last visit to a place like that. The asylum was a sprawling complex of Gothic architecture, with turrets and spires that pierced the sky like jagged teeth. The building had been left to rot, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in graffiti. The grounds were overgrown with weeds, reclaiming the space where thousands of patients had once roamed. It was perfect for what I had in mind, a place steeped in history and mystery. Getting in wasn't difficult. The chain-link fence had been cut open in places, no doubt by other explorers or thrill-seekers. I slipped through and made my way toward the main building. The front doors were locked, but a broken window provided easy access. As I hoisted myself inside, I felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming sense of desolation. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew hung heavy. The interior was just as decayed as the outside, with peeling paint, sagging floors, and the occasional scurrying of rats. I began snapping photos immediately, capturing the decay and dereliction. The light filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, creating an atmosphere both haunting and beautiful. As I wandered through the labyrinthine halls, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At first, I dismissed it as nerves. After all, the place was unnerving, to say the least. But then, I started hearing things, whispers, faint and indistinct, as if coming from just around the corner. I paused, holding my breath, straining to hear, but the sound would vanish as quickly as it came. I pressed on, telling myself it was just the wind whistling through the empty corridors. I made my way to the upper floors, where the most notorious patients had been kept. The atmosphere grew heavier with each step. The rooms were small, with rusted iron bars on the windows and chains still bolted to the walls. It was easy to imagine the suffering that had taken place here, the screams that had echoed through these halls. In one of the rooms, I noticed something strange. The dust on the floor had been disturbed, forming a clear path from the door to the far wall. But what caught my attention were the footprints, bare as if someone had walked through the dust with no shoes. They were small, like those of a child. My heart skipped a beat. No one else was supposed to be here. I followed the footprints, my camera ready, hoping to catch whatever or whoever had left them. They led me to a room at the end of the hall, one that was darker than the others. The door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was freezing, far colder than the rest of the building. There, in the corner of the room, was an old iron bed, its mattress torn and rotting. And standing beside it was the silhouette of a young girl, her back to me. She was dressed in a tattered hospital gown, her hair matted and unkempt. I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, an illusion created by the shadows. But then she turned, slowly, to face me. Her eyes were hollow, empty pits of darkness, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, a bone-deep chill that left me paralyzed. She didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, my survival instinct kicked in. I stumbled backward, dropping my camera as I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, out of the asylum grounds, and back in my car. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for the keys, desperate to get as far away from that place as possible. When I finally got home, I couldn't bring myself to look at the photos. The camera sat untouched on my desk for days, until I finally mustered the courage to review the shots. Most of them were what I expected, images of decay and ruin. But there was one that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a photo of the room with the iron bed, taken just before I had seen the girl. And there, in the corner, was a faint, shadowy figure, barely visible, but undeniably there. I never went back to Danvers, and I've avoided places like it ever since. But that image haunts me to this day, a reminder that some places hold on to the pain and suffering of the past, and that some spirits are never truly at rest. If you enjoyed this creepy, scary stories, make sure to subscribe and like this video for more stories.